We set the trend.
That's what I'm saying. I know. Are they? Are they on the benefits?
We have to look because let's do excellent tax.
I don't know, I just pay for my
No, we need to get them
No, that's
vendors.
not wrong.
We need to get them vendors.
Go to our list. Go to the back of the-
What do you think?
Oh!
In Spanish, when I thought I couldn't say peluca.
Estamos esperando el ciclo de que she's on the elevator. There we go.
Bien, don't be. Let's start.
All right.
All right. That's for you. We're just waiting for you.
Wherever you want me.
Right there.
No.
Yeah, we'll have the teeth there.
Alright, Henry's is on her way. She's in the elevator.
Look.
Folks, a bunch of folks here. I love it.
Empuja botón cuando quiera hablar.
Should we wait for Henry or should we start? She's in elevator. So.
Just hang on.
This has a distinct Last Supper feel to it.
Yeah?
Yes, you take that whole thing. The way it was.
No, cuando vaya a hablar.
Cuando vaya a hablar. I think it's the same way it is in the house.
Good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started. A couple of the members are still making their way in. Folks are at work. So thank you all for being here in support of the caucus. Thank you. So as many of you know, I'm Representative Felix. I represent District 61 in Pawtucket, and I am the co-chair of the caucus along with Senator Acosta. And I'll give some brief remarks and then pass it over to my colleagues. So on May 25th, 2020, the world witnessed the murder of George Floyd by ex-police officer Chauvin. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, Chauvin, in violation of department policy, knelt on Floyd's neck and back, causing him death because of lack of oxygen. The very next day, Chauvin was fired. We all witnessed as his dying words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry for protesters demanding police accountability. This all started with George Floyd, yet under House Bill 7263 sub A, Chauvin wouldn't get fired, but suspended with all his benefits, pending the criminal trial, which can take years, as we all know. On March, our caucus stood up and announced our 4 priorities that any Lear-Board bill must have in order for the bill to receive our endorsement. That was, as a reminder, it was annual public reporting, it was the removal of the gag order, it was a 14-day summary suspension, as well as concurrence to expedite the Lear-Board proceeding and allow for an officer to be terminated at once. While the sub-A being voted on the House today meets 3 out of the 4 priorities, it's still missing a crucial piece, and that's how do we expedite the termination of an officer who is accused of misconduct. So today we will be introducing an amendment that would allow to address a critical aspect of police accountability within law enforcement agencies. So by granting the police chief or the highest ranking officer the authority to impose disciplinary actions, including termination, for the unauthorized use of deadly force, we establish a clear and unequivocal standard for officer misconduct. By swiftly addressing these instances of misconduct, particularly those involving unauthorized use of deadly force, we contribute to the enhanced public safety, holding officers accountable for their actions, and sends a clear message that misconduct will not be tolerated, which ultimately fosters a trust and cooperation between law enforcement and our communities. In conclusion, the proposed amendment to the Leopold Bill represents a crucial step towards enhancing accountability, upholding departmental integrity, and fostering public trust. By empowering department leadership to take decisive actions in these limited circumstances of misconduct involving deadly force in violation of department rules and procedure, while still respecting due process rights, we demonstrate our commitment to fairness and effective policies that serve the best interests of all Rhode Islanders. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues.
Well, first and foremost, can we give our colleague, Representative Felix, a round of applause, please? I say that, is this mic working? Can you folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I say that not just because she just did an extraordinary job laying out the issues, like the good lawyer that she is, but for her leadership. This work is hard, building consensus is hard, representing communities of color that sometimes press for resources and at the forefront of these issues is hard. And so for that reason, I want to thank the co-chairs of the caucus. They do, on top of the thankless work of being representatives, they take more thankless work to chair this caucus and try to herd all of us as representatives of color here. And I thank you all very much. I also want to thank somebody who's actually not here, but somebody who served as the practically unofficial legal counsel of our committee here working on this issue, Vincent Regasta. Vincent Regasta is an expert on this issue. He's somebody who's very busy, obviously, and could not be here with us today, but we've worked very closely with him, someone who has tried over 100 Leopold cases representing cities and towns, prosecuting police officers, and somebody who is just unparalleled in his experience and his generosity. He's given a lot of time to us, he's answered a lot of our questions, and informed what we're trying to do today. And so as the author of the amendment, I want to be clear about at least a couple of things, as Representative Felix just outlined. I guess the simplest way to describe the amendment would be to talk about the summary punishment portion of the bill that's going to be presented today. Right now, under the current Leopold regime, the chief can only punish an officer for 2 days prior to triggering that officer's right to go to a panel and essentially appeal that decision. The bill today would change that, and it would improve it, there's no question about that, but not quite enough, especially when we talk about the use of deadly force. The bill today, that's presented today, would create 2 tiers. One, where officers can be punished for 5 days for what we call minor infractions without triggering that panel. And basically, everything else could be punished up until 14 days. And what we've done is take one line out of the bill, the first line, if you will, out of the 14-day category, the use of unauthorized deadly force, and say, this belongs in a different category. If somebody uses deadly force in a way that's unauthorized, in a way that's against the law, against policy, that conversation shouldn't be 14 days. That chief should be able to make whatever decision is appropriate. It may be termination, it may be not, but it should not be treated like everything else. We're saying that not just because of the murder of George Floyd, although that was the catalyst that kicked off this conversation, but this concern is not theoretical in Rhode Island. Even since George Floyd, we've seen 3 or 4 cases where deadly force has been seen on camera. And you know, you run the risk of folks somehow becoming innocent at trial, which again is a separate question. We completely honor what the jury does with respect to process. But what we're saying is the employment consideration of that officer is a completely different question from whether or not they're found innocent or guilty at trial. And we shouldn't connect those 2 things. As we mentioned, when George Floyd happened, Derek Chauvin was fired the next day. Now, let me be clear about at least 2 things, 2 questions that keep coming up and what we've been wrongly accused of doing. Some folks might say, either in good faith or bad faith, that we're trying to deprive an officer of his due process rights. It's not true. Leopold is the bill, at least today, is a 16-page document. We're talking about a paragraph. Due process in the context of employment and labor law means if you're accused of doing something wrong, you get an opportunity to receive notice. You get to know what it is that's being said about you. You get to respond. You get to talk to an attorney. You get to have an opportunity to confront the accusations against you. All of that would be preserved with this amendment, with what we're talking about. And in fact, Leopold is very specific about when an officer can be questioned and how many breaks they can get and when they can talk to the attorney, and all of that is fine. We don't want to take away their due process at all. Well, the point is that we in Rhode Island have chosen to provide that officer with so much more beyond that. That's where we get into thinking about the panel and pausing everything and calculating back pay in a situation where an officer is found innocent at trial. And so by no means are we trying to hurt police officers. They have difficult jobs, these are difficult questions, we understand. But back to giving credit to this caucus and doing the hard work of building consensus. When you kill someone, or use the force to kill someone, when our government, funded with our taxpayer dollars, does these things, we need to have a serious conversation, and we need to hold these folks accountable. Now, some may allege that waiting 4 years and 3 trials and any number of events in between is accountability. To them, I would say, justice delayed is justice denied. It is a very different message to fire Derek Chauvin the next day after he killed George Floyd versus in Rhode Island, have that case pending and even entertain conversations of the back pay that he might and could be entitled to. This is not personal, it's not retaliatory, it's not wrong. Other states have done this, other states live in this world. Other states enacted sweeping reform right after the murder of George Floyd. Progress in Rhode Island has stalled. But I want to thank this caucus for doing this work, and I want to thank everyone. We've spoken to many folks, there's many conversations going back and forth. We respect our colleagues who engage in the hard work of understanding this and reaching out to us and asking for our guidance, and we appreciate your time as well. So with that said, I'd like to pass it on to the other co-chair of the Black and Latino Caucus, Senator Jonathan Acosta from Rhode Island's favorite square mile in Central Falls.
Thank you, Reverend Batista. Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, and the litmus test that we're using, George Floyd, plus Rashard Gore. Historians make a distinction between events and structure. And the events of the last 10 years have forced us to think about the structure of policing and the structure of police accountability. What we know from reading this bill, and I would challenge any of my colleagues in either chamber to go toe-to-toe on the details of this bill, because I have spent a lot of time looking at it, considering every single scenario that is possible. And what I can tell you is, in New York, after Eric Garner was killed in 2014, it took that police department until 2019 to terminate that police officer's employment. In Minneapolis, after George Floyd was killed, that police department terminated their employment within 24 hours. In Rhode Island, we are in the New York scenario. The bill that we're considering today on the House floor keeps us in the New York scenario. This caucus finds that unacceptable. I want to thank my colleagues, our supporters who are here today. We have never been forced to have to stand together in this way. We refuse to cower to any threats about other bills, about other budget items on this particular issue, because we know where it's going to take us. We don't want to wait to have our own George Floyd, Eric Garner scenario here in Rhode Island and look around and tell folks, I told you so. To our allies who have agreed to support this amendment, we want to thank you. To some of the supposed progressives, reformers, and white allies who are currently whipping votes and saying things like, just vote for it, this isn't a problem in our community. Thank you for your reminder that you are not like us, that you are not committed to addressing this issue. And so today on the floor at 4 o'clock, we will put that chamber to the litmus test. And next week, the Senate will face the same litmus test. But we invite everybody to reject keeping us where we are and to at least, as a floor, establish that if there is a finding that a police officer uses deadly force in violation of departmental policy and rules and regulations, then they can be terminated by their chief. That is the floor that we are asking for. That is the floor that exists in Minneapolis, and it's still almost burned to the ground, and one that we deserve to have here in Rhode Island for our residents and to continue to build a better relationship between law enforcement and our community. So with that, I want to thank everybody for being here, and we'll take a few questions. Thank you.
I wonder if you could develop, if you will, a nuance of the term deadly force. Recently, in Pawtucket, a Pawtucket police officer in West Greenwich used what someone would describe as deadly force, which fortunately did not end up killing the young man. Do you,
Sure,
how does that
and
work?
I'm glad you brought this up, right? So we've been having a lot of conversations, and in our defense, we've had 5 days to prepare a response
Absolutely.
to what was put to the table that was supposedly a compromise that took our voice into consideration. Now that said, each department has this established. There are rules and regulations for this, right? The Rhode Island chiefs talk and define what deadly force is. Anytime you discharge your firearm, that is deadly force, right? There is a difference between physical force, deadly force. We know when headlocks can be used, right? We know when holds that cut off people's breaths, only in situations where lethal force is already authorized. These things are already established, right? And so that's not a question. Every police officer accused of something, just like any individual accused of something, would have an investigation. And if there is a finding that in the course of carrying out their duty, they violated departmental policy using deadly force as defined by their own rules and regulations, then we believe the chief should have the discretion to fire that officer.
If the legislation passes over your objections, are you willing to discuss publicly the type of political ramifications that might take place and your willingness to revisit the legislation in the next term?
Just watch them. You can go to RhodeIslandLegislature.gov, hit bills and laws, look at status of a bill, hit prime sponsor, and look at the people that are standing here right now, and then do a compare and contrast of what passed last year versus what passed this year. Come on, man. You're a good reporter. You know how to do it.
No, but let me clarify. What I meant was, if the bill passes over your objections, do you anticipate using political force in the upcoming elections, in the upcoming election season, to clarify your
I think
opposition?
what's important, and the reason why we're having this press conference right now, right before this vote takes place at 4, is because we want the public to understand what this bill implies. We want legislators, our colleagues, to know how this will play out. We understand it. We can see it in the law. We know that if you use deadly force in violation of departmental policies and you are charged for a crime, you are suspended indefinitely. You cannot be terminated until your criminal charge is adjudicated. And we take issue with that.
Can you explain the timeline that you envision a deadly force incident? Either it was justified, unjustified, but how much time do you think, and what would the process be for a police chief to decide whether it was against policy and that officer should be immediately terminated?
Sure, the Attorney General actually has a policy for a review of all cases that involve deadly force. And so you can access that, that's publicly available online. So what I would say is, if you look at the Minneapolis case, right, that department, because of the evidence available, was able to come to a finding pretty quickly. And that's why they were able to terminate those officers. I think it's going to vary in case by case, but we do expect it'll take less than 5 years.
If this amendment fails, how many members has the caucus convinced to vote against the bill in the House and in the Senate?
I can say that there is some uncertainty about what's going to happen in the next hour. You see who you have in front of you now. We do have a commitment of our caucus members, the overwhelming majority, and some allies, many of whom you see here today, to support the amendment. What happens with the bill, I think the majority of the folks you see in front of you today are going to vote no on the bill. But we'll see what happens in the next hour.
Another question. You mentioned something that went by pretty fast about, sounded like somebody has threatened you about what's going to happen to other bills, budget issues. Have you received any threats that if you vote against this, something may happen to your legislation?
Sure, yeah.
From who and what were the threats?
I'm not comfortable expressing that.
That's a pretty strong accusation. I wish you would, please. Was it
On your
leadership?
wish.
leadership. Yeah, I can do that, but you did make the statement at an important press conference where you're trying to say people are putting pressure on you.
Yeah,
And I'm trying to understand, is this from the leadership in the Senate?
I think I've told you what I'm willing to tell you. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Appreciate you.
Thank you.